Hi, I'm Raphael Heath, the Head of Geography at the Royal High School, Bath, and this is part 5 of a series of tutorials explaining how you can use GIS mapping to investigate the patterns of crime. Very useful for geographical investigations, particularly for sixth form students. This is supported by the Royal Geographical Society as part of their innovative teaching grant. So just a reminder, so far we've looked at sources of data where you can get ready-made maps and so on online. We looked at getting police data into GIS, and this is where you can personalise your investigation and get a lot of local specific data to the region you want to look at, the right timescales and so on that you want to explore. We looked at visualising the data in ArcGIS Online to make it clear what the data is, the patterns are, and finally looked at hotspot analysis to particularly look at statistical sort of mapping techniques to actually visualise and explore the pattern within your data, and that's slightly higher level stuff. So this part 5 is going to be explain the crime patterns. After all, having looked at the pattern of crime, as you can see here, we want to understand why the pattern is like this. So we've kind of done a describe. Now we're moving into a bit more of explain, which is the higher level part of any investigation. So we got the dots here to represent crime. I talked a bit about filtering before. You don't have to look at all crime. We have done for this exercise, but you could filter to a crime type and then do the analysis on that. We've talked about doing density maps. This is a heat map to look at the pattern. We talked about doing hotspot maps to explore the concentrations and statistical concentration of hot and cold spots within the data, and doing a density map to look at the density of occurrences of crime per sort of mile or kilometre square of their occurrences. So different ways of visualising and expressing the data in a more sophisticated way to show the pattern. So now the question is, well, why on earth are crimes higher in some areas than others? We've got clusters here, we've got some slight tinges of clusters in other places that different maps help to show us, and here, slight higher concentrations. The blue areas, there is no statistical significance of high concentrations of crime. So the question is, why are these clusters occurring? So what we need to start doing now is bring in some more primary or secondary data. So you can go off and do some field work and bring some data in. This is where, so you might not be looking at a city-wide level. You might start saying, well, I'm going to focus on a particular area, whether it's a rural or urban area. So maybe that you're focusing just on the city centre, like here in Bath perhaps, a sort of small manageable local investigation, and you're going to do some kind of surveys around here perhaps, for example, looking at trying to sort of do a crime assessment score, perhaps visual sort of assessment of crime vulnerability, whether areas are got very dark alleyways, whether they are poorly lit, and those kind of crime assessment factors, and you can sort of bring your own data in using exactly the same techniques that I've kind of showed you so far about bringing in the police data from a spreadsheet. You can create your own spreadsheet and bring in data essentially. I'll talk more about that in another tutorial perhaps. Let's show an example of bringing in data like that. I'm going to search for layers and just use one that I've pre-done, rather than talk about creating a brand new one from scratch. So let's go into here and just bring in something that I know I've produced before. So some of you may have been involved in the world record event that I ran. Let's see if that brings it up. Not event. Okay, so I put a layer here that I know exists. You can use this as well. It's publicly available data. But what I did is a world record event for students to assess the quality of life in their home area. Some of you may have been involved in it. So you can see a dot here. Someone from King Edward School has replied to this, and they gave scores out of 0 to 10 about how they rated the area in terms of peacefulness, parks, air quality, cleanliness, and so on. So this data is available for all sorts of places in the world. They've got about 11,800 dots across the world on these maps, so some areas have got more data than others. One of the factors I asked them is, how safe do you feel at night in your area on a score of 1 to 10, with 10 being very safe and 1 being very unsafe to walk alone at night. So this person's given a 7 for that scoring. So I could visualise that data. So this could be, as I said, a sort of actual primary data that you brought in, doing a survey of your community, of students in your school and so on, based on where they live. It could be done in the same kind of way. And that can then be compared to the crime data, or maybe a specific type of crime data, because it might not be relevant to shoplifting or something like that, but it might be relevant to violent crime or other sort of muggings and from the street and so on. So you could filter the data down of this, remember, just to show a particular type of crime, and then use that against the pattern. I showed you in a previous tutorial about how you would use the filtering tool. So I'm not going to go over that again now. So let's just quickly visualize this data just to show you the principle again. So at the moment it's just showing blue dots for location, and I could instead use it for looking at the safety at night schools, and it's bringing up proportional circles, so it's showing bigger circles for where people feel safe at night and smaller circles for where they feel less safe. So I could stick with that, or I could pick something with colours and amounts in. So it's going to get a little bit confusing because of all the dots on the map, so I'm just going to play around with that very quickly. I've shown before about the idea of classifying data. 4 different intervals, 5 different intervals based on, I think we'll go for equal intervals. So we've got the lowest scores to highest scores for safety at night split equally. Obviously a lot of people said they were safe. You can see on the grey bar here, lots of people said they were safe, but there are a few scores people that said they're not safe, so we're interested in seeing who they are and where they are, essentially. I can make these symbols a little bit bigger to visualise them and play around with the fill of them. So I'm going to go for that colour, and the low score is going to be red, so red's fine, sort of more afraid at night. That's going to sort of work for me. And so you can see these bigger circles kind of appearing now, the red's being less safe at night in that area. So again, we've got lots of dots in the maps. This is where I might switch from a dot for my crime data to a density map or so on, and then I can focus on the circles or dots for the fear of crime kind of patterns, and one of my other layers perhaps instead for the crime data, showing it. It's not probably the best colour scheme to have picked, but again I can play around with that, too many overlapping colours. But you see the sort of basic idea and principle. I play around with the size and shape of it. So that's an example of data that exists out there. You can use that. There's fear of crime data for large parts of the world. If I go to somewhere like Bristol, Bath, there doesn't produce very strong patterns in this particular data, but if I go to Bristol, for example, there's not a huge amount of data, but we can see it's a little bit more sort of oranges and reds in this part of Bristol, a little bit more blues and greens in this part of Bristol. And if I had brought in the crime data here, then we might see something different in the nature of, let's say, thefts on the streets or violent crime in those two areas, perhaps. In Bath, the pattern is, as I say, slightly less clear of that, but that's the nature of doing research. Sometimes you find things and sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's to do with methodology, sometimes it's to do with the truth, the nature of the pattern in data, and it's equally valid to find no pattern relationship. Don't feel forced in an investigation to have to find a relationship desperately. If there is none, then that's fine as well. Let's go back to our crime data here. Okay. So that's an example of some secondary data you can access for large parts of the UK. Got some places beyond as well with that fear of crime data, or you can produce your own primary data based on something like that, or some other primary data. Let's add something else, because the other thing that's really interesting to look at here is sorry, just got interrupted there for a sec. The other thing I want to show you is adding some secondary data to this map. So if I search for layers now, we could look at the relationship between crime and perhaps social and economic data. So if I put in UK economic, for example, and this is where you can see here I'm searching, so I should have said before, when you first do this, it'll probably say this, search my organisation, and you may or may not have layers in your organisation's maps, but you tend to pick this one, ArcGIS Online, and then you can search just as if you were searching the web, but searching what's in ArcGIS Online for stuff. So it's a little bit of kind of a hit and miss, a bit of a random exercise to find stuff. But if you type in keywords and try out layers, it's a bit like using, Wikipedia or Google. You just see what you get, and you might find something very useful. But I know this one, UK economic activity, is a useful layer, and I can add that to the map. I'll pick another one that might be easier first. If I put in deprivation, So this is index and multiple deprivation. Notice that it says who's made the maps, and that's quite good. If you see that something's been made by a random individual, then again you've got to bear in mind the quality of the data and try and ascertain where it's from. This is made by Esri UK team, so it's high quality data from a good source. I know that Esri UK, who produce this whole software, are going to source data from a high quality, and they've produced this multiple deprivation index, which is a really good sort of way of looking at whether deprivation links to crime patterns. So I'm going to add that one. You can see it's done for the southwest region, which is the region I'm in. If I was in another part of the country, I'd pick another region. So here I've got another layer of my map now, index and multiple deprivation, and I've also got my crime data underneath it in dots. So it looks all green at the moment, not very impressive. I click on a boundary here, you'll see that it's got Bath and North East Somerset, and it's got deprivation scores. If you are familiar with deprivation scores, you understand that basically what happens is they rank everywhere in the UK, the 31 or so thousand areas in the UK, these polygon shapes, into ranking from 1 being the most deprived for a factor, so it's not a good thing to be 1, and 31,000 or 34,000, I think if I have the whole of UK up, for being the least deprived or best score for a particular factor. So you've got the index and multiple deprivation that adds all these factors together and combines them, or you've got individual factors, so you can say, well, I'm not looking at multiple deprivation, perhaps I want to look at just whether health deprivation or education deprivation correlates or overlaps with crime deprivation and so on. So, and you've even got a layer for crime deprivation itself here, which should hopefully overlap to some extent with the map, that the data could be sourced from a slightly different data source and time scale, because obviously this is just maze data, for example. So let's say I want to show this data a little bit more clearly. Go back to the change symbols here, as you should know, and at the moment it's just showing location, hence why they don't look very useful. And I might go for income deprivation. So this is just focusing on income, not other parts deprivation, not education, so on, though they may well overlap. And it's going to have a little think about changing the symbols. And the bigger the circle, actually the least deprived it is, and the smaller circle, the most deprived it is. It's not easy to see that pattern for this purpose, so I'm going to pick a Choropleth colour shaded map. So this is a quite nice colour shaded map. If I go into the options for that layer, I can see that the lighter colours are the worst areas, the most deprived on income, so I can see a deprivation here, so, for example, and the dark blue, the least deprived, the higher numbers on this scale. I could just leave it at that, but I'll play around with it to make it perhaps more clear. Do my classified data that I mentioned before. Maybe pick 5 different intervals. You can keep picking up to 10, but it's hard to see different colour shadings beyond 5 or 6 sometimes. And you can play around with how the breaks work in the data. So you can have, let's change the colours for this. Let's go for my green to red. Red is going to be the most deprived and green the least. So here we go, and I think that sort of jumps out a little bit stronger as deprived and not deprived areas. Obviously this is all dependent a little bit about how I've chosen the breaks in the data, so there are different ways of expressing it. Standard deviation within the data, changes it slightly, quantile patterns and so on, change it slightly again, so it's puts a more even number of scores within each area for their occurrences. So anyway, let's leave it on that one. For example, it highlights 2 or 3 areas that have higher deprivation. Their score on this table between 196, so 1 would be the worst, as I said to you, in the country, to 10,000 on the deprivation scale, which are lower end compared to the higher income areas. So this is not an income in pounds, this is just a deprivation rating. We'll talk about perhaps getting real pounds and pence value of income later in another tutorial using some data enrichment tools here, but it's still a expression of the wealth in different areas. I'm going to leave it there for the moment and say done. So I've brought in a secondary data layer, index deprivation. See if I can just move this layer up. Yes, okay, if you notice there, I just clicked on those 3 dots at the end and I could drag layers up and down. I'll just put this one which has the dots data, the May, Avon crime data at the top, because that means it's showing up above the indexed for deprivation data, and I think that's in some ways clearer, otherwise the dots get lost. But again, that's up to personal choice how you show these things, and you can always change the transparency of layers. So under this layer for deprivation, transparency can also be used as a way of kind of helping or not how what you can see and what you can see through a particular layer. So I'll stick to that for the moment. So let's try and get off that. So what I've got here is a map with multiple deprivation scores and the crime data, clustering of it. It may be that probably some of my other layers aren't going to be very useful to see on top of that, but if instead I'd done my deprivation in the proportional circles instead of the shading, then I probably could have used one of the other types of maps, density maps and so on, and then proportional circles perhaps to show the clusters. But I think this works reasonably well. It shows that there are concentrations. I know that already. Let's just unclick this a sec. Let's go back to a different layer. Okay, hotspot analysis. So I know there's a concentration of high crime there, and in these two areas to some extent. And if I look at my deprivation map, take the hotspot off, you can see some similarities in the deprivation patterns. So already it's starting to tell me that perhaps there are some interesting themes and links between these two factors. So I'm starting to explore that relationship between this data visually in that pattern. I'll show you one other thing while I'm here on this, looking at adding another layer. It's slightly more fiddly, but it's quite a nice layer to add. So I'll keep that on right. Search for layers. This is the one I was going to show you earlier. It's a little bit more fiddly. If I put in UK economic, searching ArcGIS Online, then again, Esri UK Bureau, good quality source, UK economic activity. If I add that in to the layer here, it's pulled up loads of different layers and maps, which is why it's slightly more complicated. Depends where I zoom into. If I zoom out, you'll notice this layer's come on bold and it gives me slightly less data. If I zoom in, then it gets increasingly more detailed and it picks another layer to show me the pattern until I get very detailed. So it's showing me lots of detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove the other layers. So I'm going to remove so it becomes a little bit less complicated and messy. Removing that one, I'm going to remove this one. So all the ones that are grey at the moment, I'm removing that aren't showing. They're just going to show me the same this economic activity data, but with less detail. And I'm going to remove this one. Okay, so I've done my removing. You'll notice now that if I zoom out, actually, this one will go grey, so it'll disappear, and then if I zoom in, it will reappear. I can actually get around that because what it's doing under these three dots is set visibility range. It's only showing me when I zoom in, so it doesn't show me too much data. If I pull it out a little bit here manually, okay, use that as an example, then now if I zoom out, it should still display. As you can see, it's quite clustered with a lot of data, but it is displaying. Okay, so what this map is showing us is economic data, and it's got various types of economic data. It's got a border. You can see I picked here an output area for the UK. It's got designations like whether there's part-time or full-time people working in that area, unemployed and so on in that area. These are percentages, by the way, so it's not very clear from here, but they are actually percentages. So let's say I said, well, I'd be interested to see if unemployment correlates with high levels of crime, or at least certain types of crime, like I say, if I filter down to a particular aspect, antisocial behaviour or theft and so on. So here I can change this look of this layer, because I don't particularly like these pale pastely browns it's picked. I'm going to pick a particular factor, so I've got lots of things to choose from here. Loads of things to choose from. You could be looking at something like retired population. I think is it in this one it's got students, yeah, full-time student as well, so there might be a correlation with, I don't know, bicycle crime and students or something like that. There might be something interesting to look at, or antisocial behaviour in an area. So let's pick this unemployment, economically active unemployed. It's going to think about how it's going to look, so it's going to pick these circles. I'm going to go back to a chloropleth map on this occasion and change the look of it again into something I think works quite clearly, though it's not too bad as it is actually. The dark blues are areas with higher unemployment, and light colours lower unemployment. Let's just see how that looks further out. Okay, I'll leave it like that for now, but you understand how to change the colours if you so wish. So, can I move this above it? Let's try. Okay. So, there we go. So there's my crime dots. I can remind myself where those clusters are, and if I have a look at unemployment data, I can see that, just to show you the scale here, that these areas have 15% or so, 13% unemployed. So unemployed here 15%, unemployed in this central area has 13%, compared to another area I look at, let's say up here, which has unemployed 2%. And these colour schemes show that, and if I go back to my crime clusters again, I can start to see whether there are patterns and relationships between these reported crimes, clusters, and unemployment. Clearly there's social patterns and factors influencing crime are never going to be clear and straightforward. You're not going to get probably a very straight relationship where, okay, there's loads more crime in unemployed areas. It's just not going to work that way. There's going to be so many contributing factors, and of course you don't necessarily commit crime where you live, and this unemployment data refers to where people live. Crimes may be conducted by people who move out of their area. So again, there's lots of things to think about there with what the data means, but at the same time there could be patterns and clusterings in areas that do tell you about certain types of relationships between social and economic variables and the instance of crime in a location. So though you haven't statistically analysed this data, we can talk perhaps more about doing that in another tutorial. You have started to look visually at these patterns, and of course you have, as I said to you before, statistical maps which you've made in earlier tutorials, which talk about the crime patterns themselves to also help you express the overlaps between these variables. So that's a little overview of bringing in secondary data. You can play around with the search for layers now as much as you like and try and search for things. You'll find all sorts of types of stuff that will be useful, stuff that isn't useful there. So it's a bit of a searching game, but I've shown you 2 or 3 layers here which are particularly useful that you can access, that are publicly available, so that's a good starting point. So that tutorial is a little bit about beginning to explain crime patterns, bring in some secondary data, perhaps even some primary data, such as fear of crime, safety at night, schools and things like that, but also secondary data sources that you can then begin to overlap and make your crime pattern analysis a little bit more sophisticated. And you can see all this is quite quick, quite easy to do. It's free, cheap, it's online, so it should be an easy task for you, and you can do it for anywhere in the UK. I've shown it for Bath, but of course it could be for any location. All the data I've shown covers the whole of the UK. So I hope you find that useful. Let's explain crime patterns by Raphael Heath, Head of Geography, and at the Royal High School Bath. And this series of tutorials is supported by the Royal Geographical Society's innovative teaching grant.